Gintama Rumble is a game that was only released in Asia. If you live anywhere in the West, you will never find this on any digital or physical stores because it was never ported here. This is also an anime game, and one thing I've noticed over the past few years is that anime games typically are the most stubborn when it comes to dropping their prices over time. That's why if you try to buy this on the PlayStation Store, it's usually around the range of full price games unless they're on sale. With that said, it is pretty cool that you can actually buy games from other regional stores. That's one of the things about PlayStation that I will give them credit for. Not only do they not region lock their games, but they will let you create multiple accounts, which I know sounds weird to say. Like, why would I even bring that up as a compliment? Well, because you'd be surprised by how many online services explicitly forbid their users from having duplicate accounts. In fact, you can actually get banned for having multiple accounts. So the fact that Sony hasn't done that yet, and, they're obviously not alone on this. I'm not saying they're unique for this, but the fact that they can let you create more than one account, and also just how easy it is to create one for a different region than the one you live in without any sort of VPN service, is something that I will give them credit for. I bought a lot of games from both Japanese and Hong Kong stores, so I can safely say that I've benefited a lot from this. It's honestly a very smart thing to do if you want to save some money in some events, because one country may be offering a better sale than the other when it converting to currencies. The drawback is that you do need to purchase PSN cards because your payment methods are probably not going to work, and there are some games, mainly adult themed, that will not let you purchase it unless you can insert an actual payment method. I guess it's to verify that you're not a child, and the payment method in question has to match the region of the account, and I think that's the real reason for why Sony lets you create more than one account, because they won't let you purchase digital games unless your card matches the region of the digital store. So if you move to a new country, you're kind of forced to create a new account. Granted, you can still use the previous one, they won't lock you from downloading and playing the games that you paid for, and you can easily just add multiple accounts and share titles with each other, no issue. But if you want to buy new games in the digital store matching your new country, also assuming that you've gotten a new card, which is very likely since you just moved, you have no choice but to create a new account because they just simply won't let you add a foreign card. So this is something you will need to take into consideration, but at least in my experience, this has been somewhat of a minor setback. Now, another thing you'll sometimes have to deal with when exploring Asian stores is that some of them may not be translated in English or even have the option to play it in the language matching the region. This tends to happen especially when the game was never ported in the West, and with Gintama Rumble, this would typically be the case. But friends, let's dedicate some time to the chats from Southeast Asia because they actually translated the game in English for that region. So if you want to buy this game and you want to play it in English, the Indonesian store should be good enough. Just buy PSN cards on reputable sites. I use one called Play Asia. I've never had any issues with any past purchases, and once you buy a PSN card, they will give you the redeem code and you can use it to buy the game. Pretty easy, I would say. And the best part is that you can actually install the game and still play it on a different account. They're not gonna ask you to log into the right account or stay connected to the internet every single time you want to boot up the game. You just have to enable the settings to allow you to share titles between profiles, which partially requires setting up your own primary account, and once you're able to work around this, you're good to go. However, despite my long rant, that's not what I ended up doing. Instead, I got this bad boy that I ended up ordering from Amazon like a true GigaChat. Not for using Amazon, oh no, fuck that site, but for buying the physical game. Now look, I don't mind buying digital games from online stores every once in a while, but in this case, I definitely needed to buy the physical copy. Now, I wouldn't necessarily consider this game old. It actually hasn't been that long since it was first released, but it is a game that is in grave danger of becoming obsolete in the near future. Even when you search for this title on Amazon, it always exclaims that there are limited numbers of units available. This is not a very widely distributed game, and at this point, I'm pretty sure Bandai has abandoned the idea of profitability with this game, so this probably isn't going to get new copies or get re-released anytime soon. And if that's the case, I have to fucking get this game for preservation's sake, especially because I know that the day will come when this game will get price hiked to absurd degrees. And sure, right now we can rely on the digital store, and I'm really glad that it's still available there. But we also need to take into consideration the fact that these stores sooner or later will get shut down, and titles will eventually get delisted once they start running into licensing issues. I don't think it's gonna happen soon, especially with older and newer consoles kind of being in a merged state due to PlayStation taking backwards compatibility a little more seriously this generation, so it's probably gonna take longer for the PlayStation 4 digital front end to get shut down, but it's not gonna run forever. And when the day comes, I'm definitely gonna be glad that I have the physical copy, because this can't get delisted. This isn't reliant on dedicated servers. It's a disc that contains data that you install on your console, and it will never get revoked from me. That's why I love buying physical games. Now, just for the sake of fairness, I was actually discussing this with someone else a while back, and there was actually a really good point made about disc preservation, which is the fact that they only work with the respective consoles that they were designed to run on. And this is definitely true. Right now, this game that I purchased can only be played on either a PS4 or a PS5. Now, I have faith that after the bullying that went through during these past few years, Sony is probably going to take backwards compatibility a little more seriously for the next few years, especially because now the hardware behind it is relatively simple compared to some of the more complex set of chips that had in the previous lineup. The PS4 and 5 are basically just x86 AMD builds, and as long as they continue to push for this more accessible and recognizable architecture, I'm sure it'll make it easier to allow backwards compatibility in future devices. But one thing is for certain, there's no guarantee that this will be the case, and I definitely do agree that you shouldn't trust any company in doing the bare minimum of preserving their games, because I think we can all speak from experience that these gaming companies don't give a fuck about preserving their titles. Now, in my defense, the reason why I like buying physical copies is because I have this innate hope that sooner or later, we the community will find ways to read this disc. I like using PCSX2 as an example. Did you know that you can run PS2 games directly from their discs on your PC by simply using PCSX2? It's not something that I would necessarily advise doing because they do have some stability issues on higher resolutions, but you can do it. And that's because the format for those discs has long been decrypted, and the scene has matured enough on the PC side that it's not hard to find software that runs discs with CSS encryption. So I feel pretty safe buying PS2 games. Now when it comes to PS3 games, I know ways of backing it up, mainly with an exploited PS3, which I do have, and I actually have backed up all of my PS3 games. It's the first thing I do every time I buy a new one. Although admittedly, all PS3 consoles will eventually die out, and I'm definitely concerned about the future of PS3 preservation because it's literally the only way to preserve these games. We still don't have reliable software to dump PS3 ISO files on PC, so we are in a bit of a tight position, but I believe that one day we will find a new path, and I have a lot of faith on the modding scene, which is why I do prefer buying physical discs. There's also emulation, which will allow us to play older games, sometimes in better conditions than in the original native results. In fact, with PS4, things are looking much brighter because there are projects out there that provide not so much emulation, but a compatibility layer, namely FPPS4. Now, if you don't know what a compatibility layer is, you know how the Steam Deck and Linux as a whole plays Windows games almost as if they were native? The way it achieves this isn't through emulating Windows, which would be a much more taxing endeavor because they would literally have to emulate hardware level instructions of a Windows machine. What they do instead is use a compatibility layer, namely Proton, which more so translates system calls from one operating system into calls that the host OS recognizes. In the case of Proton, it mainly aims to convert the DirectX API calls into Vulkan, because Linux doesn't support DirectX, that's a proprietary Windows API. It does, however, support OpenGL and Vulkan. A lot of people assume that doing this is resource intensive and kills performance, which is not necessarily true. A lot of the times, if a game runs better on Windows, it's usually because it's just better optimized for that operating system, not necessarily because the translation layer is eating up system resources. Granted, some processing work is done for this to happen, obviously, but it's not as much as you would think. In fact, a lot of older games actually run better on Linux than they do on Windows because the conversion to the Vulkan API through Proton and DXVK actually produces better results than whatever legacy solution Windows has. Now, I'm just going to say this up front. This is not an easy test to do. PlayStation has their own exclusive proprietary APIs that are probably going to take quite a long time before they're able to be translated into something that modern computers can recognize. It's going to take years, maybe even more than a decade before these PlayStation compatibility layers mature, but when they do, I honestly believe that this will set a new precedent for console preservation, and when that happens, I will have my PS4 copy ready to test. Because no matter how you see it, this game will never get re-released. It will never be ported to PC or other gaming platforms. This is basically a nuisance to Bandai Namco. It didn't sell all that well, and I'm not entirely sure what's the licensing situation. I know that in terms of the anime series, they had a hand in the production even up until the final movie, but that's mainly their animation division. As for their gaming division, I'm willing to believe that they might still have the license to publish this game, but I don't think they'd be willing to fight for it if there were any conflicts in the publishing rights. So right now, we're essentially relying on Sony to keep the game up in the digital store, which I'm sure it will remain there for many years to come. But if the day comes when they delist it, which is not unlikely, this can happen, it happened with Jump Force, I will at least have the physical copy because that's the one thing that they can't take away from me. It does become my responsibility to preserve this, but if I'm being honest, I trust myself more than I do these gaming companies. But as of right now, what can we do for PlayStation 4 preservation? Well, there are a couple of things. For one, we actually can back up the game files through an exploited PS4. I don't have one myself, but I'm gonna see if I can get one later down the line. Maybe a PS4 Pro with 9.00 firmware. If you have one, you can actually run some WebKits that allow you to execute kernel exploits, and you can install some homebrew software that can help you back up your games. Funnily enough, it should also work with digital games, but I would advise you to be very careful about signing into your PSN account on exploited consoles because they could ban you. Another reason for why you should stick to physical games. I think for now that's our golden solution. It's not perfect, in fact it can be pretty annoying to keep up with the jailbreaking scene due to how every exploit only works with specific firmware versions which are impossible to roll back to, but it is by far the best and really only solution for backing up PS4 games. Now, there is something else I would like to bring up, which is the idea of Gintama Rumble, as an example, being ported to the PC platform. If that were to happen, that would actually be great for its preservation. It's a lot easier to back up PC games because Windows is a much more open platform compared to consoles, and it's really easy to access game files and archive them. However, while it's definitely easier, and I always long for my favorite games to be available on PC platforms, which is why often I'll just buy games that I already own again just so I can have the PC version. I don't even care about the money, I just do it because there are games that I love and I want to have the PC version. However, there is one small caveat. Compared to console games, PC games are a little more legally bound. What do I mean by this? You see, all licensed pieces of digital media are protected by copyright and digital rights management laws, and the act of circumventing DRM in any way is actually illegal. It's even written on Section 1201 of the US copyright law. To circumvent a technological measure means to descramble a scrambled work, to decrypt an encrypted work, or otherwise to avoid, bypass, remove, deactivate, or impair a technological measure without the authority of the copyright owner. This is considered illegal, and because most PC games tend to have some kind of protection in place to prevent piracy, while copying the game files and archiving them in a safe storage may not necessarily be illegal by itself, at least for as long as you still have the license to use that piece of software. I'll get to that in a minute. What would be illegal is circumventing the DRM built in order to play them. And there are a lot of forms of DRM, it's not just the likes of Denuvo where this can be found. With Steam games, for example, they have built-in DRM that prevents people from playing those games if they aren't authenticated with their accounts. There are ways to bypass it, but as highlighted earlier, those methods would be considered illegal. Now the thing is, we as consumers actually do have permission to back up the media that we own. That's actually a right that is granted to us, but only for as long as we own it. It's written, notwithstanding the provision of Section 106, it is not an infringement for the owner of a copy of a computer program to make or authorize the making of another copy or adaptation of that computer program, provided too that such new copy or adaptation is for archival purposes only, and that all archival copies are destroyed in the event that continued possession of the computer program should cease to be rightful. Now, what this basically means is that for as long as you own the copyrighted content in question, you're absolutely allowed to have a backup of it. But if for whatever reason you no longer have possession of it, then any archival copies you have are considered illegal. Now, the reason for why this is an issue is because with digital games, your license can be revoked from you. It can happen if either your account is banned or hacked, and also if the game gets delisted. With physical games, this can't happen. It's a physical, tangible copy that you own. That's why you can back up the ISO and game files at all costs without worrying about doing anything particularly illegal, as long as you're the one that's dumping the files from your disk. If you're downloading it off of the internet, even if you still own it, I'm pretty sure that would still be illegal. But if you're dumping the game yourself, then at worst you might be in the legal gray area since the copies that you're making might be considered unauthorized. But other than that, you'll probably be fine from a legal viewpoint. With PC, you're only as fine for as long as you have the license to play the game, which will eventually expire because these games are maintained through dedicated servers that have no real legal obligation to keep running for all eternity. And if they feel like shutting you down, or just removing you from their ecosystem, which they can do it without even giving any reasonable explanation, then you no longer have any legal permission to archive the content. So your library essentially becomes a ticking time bomb, one that will blow in your face at any point when the license eventually expires. Now, if you've watched my past videos, then I'm sure you know that at this point that I'm not exactly someone who respects copyright laws, and I have no sympathy for companies when people pirate their media, especially when they're doing a bad job of preserving it. I have ample respect for any site maintainers out there and data hoarders that archive old and new games, allowing them to continue to exist for years to come, and we can all revisit them in case we ever get to a point when these games become harder to obtain officially, which is bound to happen at some point. So I'm not even really speaking from a perspective of someone who's a stuck up to the law. I honestly don't even think I will ever go to jail if I ever decide to pirate media because copyright laws in Portugal are kind of goofy. However, what upsets me is the fact that we as consumers are not legally protected in these types of scenarios. And you'd think that they're rare or isolated, but that's not true. Trust me when I say this. Accounts getting hacked, banned, and inaccessible to the users, inadvertently losing the library of games that they paid hundreds of dollars for. This happens literally every day. No bullshit. Every single day of my life, I see reports of people who lost access to their digital games for bullshit reasons like this. And I honestly think that lawmakers and regulators need to investigate this because these companies are in a pretty abusable position of power, and the consumers not having any legal leverage for the content that they spent on is, to me at least, a huge breach of consumer rights. While we wait until copyright laws catch up to modern times, I guess we'll just have to continue walking this legal landmine and seeing how far we can get away with archiving games on third-party sources. In the meantime, I'm just gonna continue playing Gintama Rumble, which I like quite a bit. The combat system is more liberating than I thought. I will share my thoughts on this game soon, but so far, I like what I'm playing. For the most part. I think that's all I had to share. Take care.